Hey there, fellow DIYers. When I was taking a road trip from Arizona to Tennessee, some interesting things happened along the way. One of the most interesting things was the tiny boat, the boat project that I modified to take to Tennessee for, the whole thing there. That kept breaking loose in my toy hauler, and I just kind of gave up and let it sit against the wall here on the back of the trailer, and really it damaged the ramp. It punctured a hole right through the rubber matting. Dealt with it. I handled it on the way back. I fixed the issue with it coming loose, but it was already too late. So there's some things broken in the trailer. One of the things that needs to be addressed, I think, fairly immediately is this gigantic scratch mark. Looked like a bear clawed the back of my skid. So we're gonna fix this somehow, some way. We're gonna get it done like we always do. So this damage is particularly extensive, probably a lot worse than what most people are going to do to the back of their skid. But we're going to cover it all. First of all, we're going to repair the wood that we broke into, and then we will be fixing the rubber matting. You will need liquid tape, a soldering iron, a heat gun, and if you damage it all the way to the wood, some marine epoxy. You could use wood putty, but I don't just trust wood putty on something that's structurally integral. That's more of a cosmetic fix, not something that's going to make the wood stronger where you damaged it. And first things first, we're going to be cutting out all of this ripped up, rubber that we damaged on the mat. It's gonna be pretty useless. And plus, we can't repair what we did underneath unless we cut it out. And if you just damage the mat, you're still gonna have to maybe cut this out in chunks to level it out, because you can't really just melt stuff right on top of the mat. I mean, you could try, but I don't know how well that's gonna work for you. It's better just to reform the mat the way we're gonna do it here. Okay, so when you're cutting out the matting, or if you have to cut into the wood, you have to leave angled out bevels. You can't leave any underhang to where air bubbles can get trapped inside. That's going to cause you problems with the stuff you're going to use to try and repair this. So as we were cutting it, we were angling out, so it always is beveling outward to where no air can get trapped inside. Then you want to get in there, vacuum it, clean it. We used marine epoxy over wood putty, because marine epoxy, or even if you got Gorilla Glue 2-part epoxy and you stuck it in there, it's still going to be just as stronger, or maybe stronger than the parent wood itself once it bonds, and it'll soak into the wood will bleed into the epoxy, it'll hold it in tight. Just make sure that your trailer skid's level at the back before you pour it, so you have the most even cure. We go ahead and pour this stuff in there, we let it cure for 24 hours, and then we revisit it to fix the rest of it. Okay, that appears that's glass. That dried and cured very quickly. That bled all the way through twice, but I think it'll be okay. We can go ahead and we can apply some other things here. Once the epoxy dries, it's like glass and not very stickable too, so you kind of want to go in there and re-rough it up with some fairly abrasive sandpaper. And then after you rub it up, just go ahead and clean it. I'm using rubbing alcohol and a microfiber cloth to feel that that'll get out most of the contaminants. And then we are using liquid tape from the hardware store. It's fairly cheap, you can find it anywhere, and it's severely underrated for what it can do. You can mold this stuff once it dries, just like any other plastic hard coat. The only thing is, if you're gonna do it in layers, you have to layer it fairly thin. If you layer it too thick, the top will dry and the bottom will never dry, and it'll just be spongy. So we have to wait for a little bit to see how that works. I would use a popsicle stick or any other sort of equivalent tool to kind of spread it. You could also use your finger and some gloves. After putting the first layer down and ensuring that it was even going to stick to the epoxy, we then go ahead and take a different approach. We go and we staple down any part of the mat that we can get that's still usable, so it doesn't puff up. And then we're going to have to go in there and kind of clean up some of the rough edges, because those are going to protrude up and give us problems when we're trying to reform this. As we go on, we start to use a soldering iron. This is a cheap soldering iron that I got from the hardware store that had a bunch of attachments for the head, and obviously this one attachment mimics the exact size of one of the little rubber dots that are there for traction on the skid mat. So that works out perfectly. We go ahead and we smooth out any of these. So even if you just rip the rubber mat, just ripped it up the top and you don't like the way it looks, you can just go in with a soldering iron like this very, very carefully. Obviously you don't want to melt through the mat, but just go over it, remelt it, and push it down. I mean, that's the super easy way to just repair any sort of even minor damage to this by itself. But since we obviously have extensive damage, we're recoating and recoating. But we're going to take a different approach than just sitting there and letting it air dry, because that'll take, I don't know, forever, as thick as this mat is. So we go ahead and take a heat gun to it. And We push through. I'm using a soldering iron, or you can really use anything just to kind of continuously pop air vents, air bubbles, maybe even whole lines right through, just to make sure the liquefying agents vent out and evaporate, and that this stuff actually dries. Now, it doesn't have to be clear and dry. It can look like crap on the surface because they're going to reform it with the soldering iron. And that's the beauty of the whole thing, is the soldering iron. It's kind of a must. Now, once you've got a pretty good platform, you've filled and dried and filled and dried, it's built up pretty much even with a surface, you can start reforming the texture. In this case, the texture is all these little circles. We can reform that with a liquid tape. While it's in its liquid state, you form it, you press it down, and then you can even remelt and reform it with a soldering iron at will, as long as the soldering iron is hot enough. Another good quality about the liquid tape is that it dries flat black. And now I know this looks a little bit more shiny than the rest of the parent surface, but that's because it's clean and there's no dirt on it. Later on, we're going to show you a super easy 1 second way to fix all that. But first things first, just be tentative, be patient, repatch in until you feel satisfied with the results. It's not going to look, 100%, but you can get very close to factory. The more time you take to rework it, the better it's going to look. Observe.
Alright, so it's end result. Obviously, it's still going to be a little jacked. It's not going to be perfect. It's not molded like the rest of this. But in terms of getting it fairly uniform and the same color, and considering what it looked before, it's so much better. Even over here where the original owner melted that and sputtered all the melted stuff over here, I mean, this even looks better than that. Probably with some authentic footprints on it, it'll kind of look like it's came right at home, and yeah, it kind of looks like it's right at home now. Look at that. That's the finishing touches. You must step on it with a dirty foot to make it look like the rest of the thing. Hey, I mean, for a few hours work, we really kind of did okay there. Not perfect, but hey, I'll take this over absolutely what it looked like before.
Right, so I'm pretty happy with the rework. I would have sat there and reworked it a little bit more and got it a little bit better looking, but I got to take my kids to soccer practice, so it is what it is. You can go as simple or complex as you want. You can even go as far as to re-get the rubber matting and cut patches out and re-glue and staple it down to the wood. But I think this is actually the cleanest, more uniform way of actually maybe looking like the mat's still intact, but it's just been used a little. That's what it looks like the mat is used a little and not torn apart like it was. So I'm happy with the results. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section. Stay tuned because we're going to have an entire DIY series on RV use and repair and all that stuff.